There's a world of miracles inside our bodies.
See every color on Earth. Hear sounds that inspire. Feel more than just heat. Taste a world of flavor.
Nice.
Smell the miracles of nature. See, smell, hear, taste, touch. Widen your world.
There are those of us who like to venture to the unexplored, to see the beauty in the strange and unknown. Those of us who go out there with a sense of wonder. If you're one of us, and if you want to explore more of this great planet, we're ready to take you there. It's time. Turkish Airlines. Widen your world.
Yes, good evening again. We are in the last panel, but it is the first webinar of Eurasia Airshow 2020. At this moment, we are together with two distinguished speakers in the fields of international relations and defense. Both of them have been working in this field in respected institutions of the USA for a long time. The title of our panel is The New Age of Air Defense Strategies. I would like Mr. Brian Clark, Ms. Melanie Marlowe. Ms. Marlowe is International Security Program, one of the program directors of CSIS, and Mr. Brian Clark is Senior Research Fellow in Hudson Institute. Can you hear me at this moment? I wonder. Let me try. Yeah, and Ms. Marlowe, can you hear me? I have a difficulty to hear Ms. Marlowe at this moment. I think I can hear Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark, can you say something again?
Yes. How are you? Good evening, everybody.
But I think we need some more. If Reggie, if the technician colleagues could adjust the volume of the panelists, I'll be very happy. I can't still hear Ms. Marlowe. Let me check, please. Give me a minute. I think your microphone is switched off, Ms. Marlowe. Could you please check if your microphone is open, switched on? If you go to the down side of the frame, you will see the sign of microphone. It's a green, probably light color. There's an indication in the middle. Did you have a chance to see it? Mr. Clark, can you hear Ms. Marlowe? No,
no.
I think no. Yes or no?
Oh, no.
Oh.
No, you cannot.
No, at this moment I can hear you, Ms. Marlowe. Can you please continue to say? Yes, now it works. It works.
Okay. Okay.
Mr.
Great.
Clark,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Mr. Clark, please, can you say again?
Yes. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Hello, Melanie.
Good. Are you using a sort of a cable microphone, Mr. Clark, or a Bluetooth something system? Is it a Bluetooth?
Bluetooth.
Okay. Okay. I would like to start with Ms. Marlowe. First of all, we will listen their speeches, or let's say if they have a presentations. And then I have some questions in the second part. Yes, Ms. Marlowe, the floor is yours. But I would like to, first of all, give a brief information about our distinguished panelists. Ms. Melanie Marlowe writes on American politics with a special focus on the presidency and the Constitution. She received a BA in political science from Utah State University and MA from the Claremont Graduate University. Am I right?
Yes.
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 And she is currently a lecturer at Georgetown University in the United States of America. And Mr. Brian Clark, Senior Research Fellow in Hudson Institute. Mr. Clark is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at Hudson Institute. He is an expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, and military competitions and wargaming. Mr. Clark served in the Navy headquarters staff from 2004 and 2011. And he is in the recipient of the Department of Navy Superior Service Medal and the Legion of Merit. Yes. Now we are listening, after this brief information about the distinguished speakers, we are ready to listen. Ms. Marlowe, please, floor is yours.
Thank you. I should say also I'm really grateful to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I am a senior non-resident associate in the International Security Program, and that I am an editor at War on the Rocks. So I just want to say good afternoon or good evening to everybody. I know it's getting to be a little bit late there, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. As the title of the panel reflects, we are in a new period and a new age of air defense. And the aerial threats to United States forces abroad are nothing new. The United States Navy has been contending with the threat of anti-ship cruise missiles, for instance, for many years. But today, the United States and its allies face a broad spectrum of air and missile threats, from rockets and artillery to cruise and ballistic missiles to direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. And so within that spectrum, I'm going to focus on one category, namely that of the threat of hypersonic weapons, which are relatively new, as an example of one of this era's aerial threats. And as such, active measures to counter and actively defend against hypersonic threats will need to be a key feature of the coming years, more than it currently is today. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a military planner, I'm coming at this from an American policy perspective. And I will be focusing on the efforts that the United States is making in the area of hypersonic strike and defense, as well as some of the obstacles it faces. I'll say a few things about how these capabilities are important to meeting the security challenges facing the transatlantic alliance today. And finally, I'll talk about where the incoming Biden administration might be headed on these issues. Hypersonics, as you know, is one of the fastest growing defense issues these days for both what our adversaries are developing and the investments on the part of the United States and its allies. The reemergence and diffusion of hypersonic strike capability raises important questions about precision strike and long-range standoff relative to our broad deterrence and defense goals, as well as for the goals and institutions of the missile defense enterprise. Regardless of whether we're talking about hypersonics, supersonics, or good old-fashioned subsonics, the discussion begins with the strategic threat and policy context. The possibility of aerodynamic hypersonic systems has been around since the 1960s, but at that time, sturdy ballistic missiles seemed good enough bang for the buck. The space shuttle was a hypersonic glider, but interest in weaponization of the technology was long delayed. Discussion of hypersonics sparked a bit in the 1990s and then in the early 2000s, but the United States was too busy enjoying our unipolar moment for it to have much urgency. We convinced ourselves that Russia and China were not threats and then got busy with counterterrorism. Novel forms of conventional prompt strike were not prioritized by the United States. Russia and China saw this period very differently, and they exploited our geopolitical preoccupations to get ahead on hypersonic development. And then around 2014, we realized that history had returned. The 2018 American National Defense Strategy calls the central challenge of our time the renewed long-term competition with Russia and China. Russia's invasion of Ukraine confirmed that something had changed. Their invasion of Georgia was not a one-off. Meanwhile, the Chinese were making and continue to make all manner of mischief in the South China Sea, and they're pushing around their neighbors in various ways. The Obama administration took note of this at the tail end of their time in office, but it was the 2018 National Defense Strategy that formalized what had gradually been sinking in. And over the last 5 years or so, the United States has been moving out on hypersonic strike programs, as are a number of our adversaries and allies. Now, the word hypersonic literally just refers to speed, but what goes under the heading of hypersonics includes at least 3 distinct types of missiles. First, there's the hypersonic glide vehicles. These might be launched on ballistic missile boosters and then deployed to fall and glide across the top of the atmosphere. A second category is a really fast cruise missile powered by scramjet. These never leave the atmosphere and have a different propulsion and trajectories. But there may be other hypersonic systems as well, to include so-called aeroballistics or other maneuvering reentry vehicles. Now, to be sure, the United States has now begun to get into the hypersonic strike game as well. The 2021 presidential budget request has around $3.2 billion for various hypersonic strike programs. So HAWK, Tactical Boost Glide, OpFires, Arrow, HACM, Long Range Hypersonic Weapon, and IRCPS. Now, why is the United States or Russia or China pursuing hypersonic strike? Don't we have ballistic missiles or cruise missiles that can just perform this strike job? To an extent, yes. But the proliferation of advanced air defenses among our adversaries, as well as among our allies, has complicated the ability of older strike systems to reliably penetrate hostile airspace, and thus the confidence that one has in the ability to hold targets at risk. Russia and China have been doing a lot of investment in air defenses. Today's Patriot, THAAD, and Aegis-based defenses protect U.S. and allied forces abroad, including carrier groups and ground forces, against aerial ballistic attack. Designed to go around or under these defenses, and even to evade strategic warning, hypersonic strike is a new way to hold our forces at risk and thereby undermine our broader defense goals and alliances. This is ultimately about the credibility of U.S. power projection and the ability to protect our allies and partners. These new hypersonic delivery systems could certainly be used to target the American homeland, but their more immediate application is probably regional. So just as our adversaries are coming up with new ways to structure attacks and hold us at risk, so we are for them. These hypersonic strike programs are important to adapt our strike capabilities to the renewed reality of great power competition and to restoring the conventional overmatch. The investment made to date is a measure of our serious commitment. So to reiterate the point, hypersonic strike is not a redundant capability. The combination of maneuverability, speed, and unpredictable trajectory is qualitatively better than the legacy ballistic or cruise missile capability, or for that matter, munitions dropped from fixed-wing platforms. And just as this combination of characteristics is such a qualitative improvement, we should not expect the demand signal to be going away anytime soon. So now let's move to the defense side of the house, to countering and defending against the threat of hypersonic attacks. While the strike programs have clearly defined paths forward, this area remains a bit less established. The best approach here is a balanced one, a mix of offense and defense. Hypersonic defense is a hard problem, but not an impossible one. Just as there are no silver bullets, so too, no defense is perfect. And as with other forms of active air and missile defense, even a limited defense can have strategic effect by complicating an adversary's calculus and by buying time for U.S. and combined forces to respond. Countering as opposed to defending will be an important part of this equation, part of which is passive defense. If military forces are more mobile, dispersed, and their location is less certain, then that decreases the likelihood that the enemy can find, fix, track, and target them successfully. But active defense must also be part of a comprehensive approach. Although the National Defense Strategy endorses more dispersed and smaller basing constructs, there are limitations to this. You cannot hide Guam, and one cannot move or completely disguise an airfield or some other big facility. Even limited defenses will help complicate our adversary's calculus, improve our freedom of maneuver, and shore up our broad deterrence and defense goals. They will reduce opportunities for the adversary to intimidate or coerce the United States and its allies. The more quickly the United States can field this technology and integrate it into a comprehensive missile defense architecture, the better we can protect American carriers, forward bases, and allies through both deterrence and defense. Now, hypersonic defense is a complex form of air defense, and in air defense, as in ballistic missile defense, the fundamentals of solving this problem come down to detect, control, and engage. And this commonality leads us to how and what programs must be adapted to contend with hypersonic threats. Hypersonic defense is not going to be done in a new stovepipe all its own, but rather in connection to how we've been contending with other threats. The United States Ballistic Missile Defense Agency was stood up to build and maintain what's been known as the Ballistic Missile Defense System, the BMDS. But of course, we're now not just talking about ballistic missiles anymore. And because of that, the BMDS is renamed as the Missile Defense System, or MDS. And that change reflects how the agency is coming to grips with the complexity of this new challenge and how existing elements of the BMDS will need to be adapted. The Missile Defense Agency is now pursuing hypersonic defense within the Aegis Maritime Solution. When the United States builds and deploys hypersonic defense interceptors, they will probably be deployed on ships, or some ships, and be controlled by the Aegis Combat System. The President's budget request for hypersonic defense for fiscal year 2021 was about $206 million, although the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee increased that to $272 million, so it may rise. But back to the fundamentals: detect, control, and engage. Adapting the missile defense system to deal with the hypersonic threat challenge will involve attention to sensors, shooters, and command and control. Of all the parts of a defense, nothing matters if we cannot see the threats in the first place. The sensor conversation is the central question, and not just for the desirability of intercepting them. Tracking these threats is important for strategic warning, even if we do not have the means to intercept them. It was strategic warning that allowed U.S. troops to seek shelter in the Iranian missile attack on Al-Assad Air Base in January, where there were no Patriots available. We want just as much time as possible to respond to an incoming attack. This reminds us how important early warning is. No interceptor is better than the eyes that tell it where to go and what to kill. And there's no better vantage point than space from which to detect and track missiles in flight. The Hypersonic and Ballistic Tracking Satellite System, or HBTSS, has been a central piece of discussion for U.S. missile defense efforts for both hypersonic and ballistic missiles. The new paradigm is for large numbers of smaller and cheaper satellites in low Earth orbit, what is called proliferated LEO. The need to go to space is straightforward. Whether at sea or on land, surface-based sensors can't see over the horizon. That's been good enough for ballistic missiles, which have a predictable trajectory and fly much higher. But for maneuvering threats and those that come in lower, you need elevated sensors to look down and track them throughout their flight, what's called birth-to-death tracking. And for that, there's just no better place than space. While progress is slowly being made in this area, a space sensor layer has been on the agenda for a long time without much action. Each of the last 6 administrations, Reagan through Trump, has been committed on paper to fielding a new space sensor layer, but none has actually done so. There's been some good progress made in the last couple of years, but it's now going to fall to the next administration to deploy them. Even Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten, expressed frustration earlier this year that we are unable to go very fast on research and testing. He said, we've been doing studies since 2007. It's time to start throwing things up in the air, even if they aren't perfect on paper, and see what we can learn from successes and failures. Hypersonics also pose special challenges for command and control. Because these things can fly across multiple combatant commands, they complicate the passing of sensor data, as well as cause confusion about who is supposed to shoot at it. The unpredictable nature of hypersonic trajectories means the data handoff between sensor systems must be seamless to allow them to look in the right places for threats. How can we rapidly capture, process, and act upon that data? Finally, we have the engage part. This also has been a long time in coming due to the relative deprioritization of hypersonic defense broadly. Press accounts suggest that they are likely, at least at first, to be adaptations of today's interceptors, from Patriot to THAAD to Standard missiles. But in the longer term, more capable clean sheet interceptors will be needed. We also need to be a bit more imaginative. The intercept solution might not be limited to hit to kill or even blast frag. There may be other ways to attack an adversary's hypersonic kill chain, limit their flexibility, or otherwise channel the threat in ways that help us. Whereas directed energy has proven difficult for shielded reentry vehicles, it may have new applications here, with non-kinetic means to weaken the airframe, perhaps also electronic attack. So what might we see from a Biden administration? In the last 4 years since President-elect Biden was Vice President-elect Biden, the world again has changed. We are seeing much more concentration, new concentration on Russia and old concentration on new concentration on China and old concentration on Russia. And many Obama administration officials thought that we could placate China and Russia during those years, and I think that that has fundamentally changed. So we don't have a new Secretary of Defense yet. We had anticipated it being Michelle Flournoy, who has written extensively in the last 6 to 12 months on the need for hypersonic weapons, but also the need for technology in general, and anticipating flat defense budgets for the next several years, that the United States is going to have to make some big bets on technology, focus on capability over capacity, and accelerate innovation to serve our deterrence goals. So let me leave it here. To review, hypersonic threats are now an important part of the threat spectrum with which the United States and its allies will have to contend. We're making good progress on the strike side, but not so much on the defense side. It will need to be an offense-defense mix for hypersonic missiles, just as we have had with anti-ship cruise missiles and with ballistics. Pursuing both hypersonic strike and hypersonic defense in tandem will have mutually reinforcing effects. The more we can understand the characteristics and vulnerabilities of hypersonic vehicles, the better we can defeat them. And the more we can understand their weaknesses, the better our own strike forces can be improved for better penetration and survivability. And we're going to need investments in a comprehensive approach, working together as an alliance. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Marlowe, for your speech full of very useful information, and some of them are very real and new information. I think our audience might hear first time some of the new terms like hypersonics, hypersonic strikes, hypersonic defense, missiles, Aegis combat system, and some other very important new eras of defense technologies and defense area. Yes, we will come back. I will have some questions, Ms. Marlowe, but now I would like to listen, Mr. Brian Clark, if you are ready. Mr. Clark?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And also, it's great to be here with Melanie Marlowe, whose work I've admired for a long time. So thank you very much to Eurasia Airshow for inviting us to be here today. I'm going to be focusing on a different aspect of the missile defense challenge than Melanie did. I'm going to look at how the scale and scope of missile threats, air and missile threats, are going to change how we need to approach missile defense compared to the approaches we've taken since the Cold War. And that involves hypersonics to a degree, but it also involves just the numbers and ranges of ballistic and cruise missile threats that have evolved over the last 20 years, which is creating a need for increased capacity and also increased sophistication in our missile defense systems. And that applies both on land and at sea. If we could put up I sent some slides, so if we could put up the slides, I can start talking through those, if that'll work. Oh, terrific. So if you go back, that's fine. So if you can go to the first slide, one of the main challenges that allied countries are facing today is that the threats posed by countries like China and Russia are increasing in number as well as in range. And so if you look at this depiction of Russian missile systems that are based in the western part of Russia, or in Kaliningrad, some of which are now being based in Syria, those missile systems are now extending into Eastern and Central Europe. So in the case of NATO allies are going to have to contend with missiles that can range into areas they had traditionally thought of as sanctuaries from which they could operate, and places where they would mobilize in the event of some kind of confrontation with Russia. This trend is happening in general, so the same depiction could be created for China as well. Countries that to influence their neighbors, perhaps coerce their neighbors, are able to install missile systems that provide them the ability to threaten attacks on short notice and at large scales that could overwhelm the defense of the target country. Added to this, as Melanie said, is the hypersonic threat, which I'll talk a little bit as we go through this, but the challenge there is it adds an additional dimension of difficulty in terms of the missile problem, because the weapons are fast and because the weapons fly trajectories that missile defense systems traditionally are not designed to address. So the range and number of the weapons are a big problem. So if you go to the next slide, if you look at the China case, the range on the next slide, the ranges at which China's missile reach extend well into the thousands of miles. So you can see on this depiction, the ballistic and cruise missiles that are shown at the bottom of the slide can reach Tokyo out to nearly Guam. And if they're an air-launched cruise missile, they could extend even further. Those numbers on the y-axis, the vertical axis, show the kind of payload that the Chinese could deliver. So the People's Liberation Army could deliver in the thousands of tons of weapons over the course of just a few hours in these ballistic and cruise missile technologies. And then you add to that aircraft-delivered weapons, and that's what the gray area is at the top that overwhelms the number of cruise and ballistic missiles they could launch. So what this creates is an extreme salvo competition problem for missile defenses. They can be overwhelmed very easily with a combination of cruise, ballistic, and air-launched weapons. That enables what we might call a structured attack, where a country like China might use ballistic missiles to initially suppress an enemy's air defenses and his command and control, and then follow that with air-delivered weapons that then destroy targets like buildings or to finish the job. So these structured attacks are a major problem for missile defense systems because they're to the short the short notice ballistic missile attack that will then render them vulnerable to follow-on attacks that then destroy the remaining infrastructure. And the volume is going to be an extreme one. So if you go to the next slide, some of the challenges then are the hypersonic weapons that Melanie discussed have a very high survivability. The kind of volume that can be generated by ballistic and cruise missiles creates a problem that missile defense systems are not well designed to address. Missile defense systems, at least until recently, were designed to address relatively small numbers of cruise or ballistic missiles that would be launched at a relatively small area target, like a base or a ship deployed overseas. So to get this greater capacity, new approaches are going to be needed. So this picture depicts some of those new approaches. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you can see there's going to be an increased need to attack the archer rather than the arrow. So in this case, using offensive anti-air capabilities to attack bombers and aircraft that would be launching weapons to provide the larger payload element of a structured attack. You need to think about shooting those archers before they're able to launch their arrows. So the attack element that Melanie discussed of missile defense is going to be extremely important in the future. And in particular, going after aircraft that can provide the bulk of a country's air attack capacity. That has to be complemented, though, by a much greater capacity. So this shorter range air defense problem of defending targets that are subject to attack. And that we see is happening in the 30 nautical mile range around a target area. Today, systems like Patriot do that. Systems like the S-20 or the SA-10, SA-20, and then follow-on systems like the S-300 do that as well. So they're designed mostly for this sort of short-in attack scenario where you're trying to defend a target. To get that greater capacity, militaries are starting to invest in short-range air defenses that they can carry in large numbers because the interceptor missiles are small and relatively inexpensive. So they give you a larger number of shots at an incoming set of weapons. They're also investing more in non-kinetic missile defenses. So capabilities like high-power microwave that damages the electronics on an incoming missile, or electronic warfare that will confuse or degrade the ability of that incoming missile's seeker to find the target it's looking for, or to degrade its ability to use GPS or GLONASS to be able to navigate to the target area. Electronic warfare and high-power microwave are increasingly being used for missile defense purposes. But to use those energy weapons to defeat an incoming missile, you have to missile close enough for you to engage it above the horizon. So those systems like electronic warfare, high power microwave, and even lasers can't shoot over the horizon. So you have to wait for an incoming weapon to get within 10 nautical miles of you so you can actually shoot it, which involves a bit of, missile defenders aren't happy about the idea of letting an incoming missile threat get 10 miles before they shoot it. But that's the only way you're going to be able to take advantage of these non-kinetic capabilities and energy weapons, missile defense operations. So that's the major trend we're seeing is this shift towards shorter range systems to get that greater capacity, and then the longer range weapon, the offensive operations to engage the shooter before it can launch its weapons. If you go to the next slide, that is able to generate a much higher defensive capacity. So this chart depicts the defensive capacity available with a traditional weapon system, which is on a DDG-51 class ship, so an Arleigh Burke class destroyer of today's U.S. Navy, but it's similar with other navies as well, is we tend to use longer range interceptors because we want to shoot every incoming target as far away as possible. Those longer range interceptors, though, are larger and more expensive, so I can't get many of them. So on the left side of the chart, you can see the defensive capacity at 100 nautical miles is relatively small, so you might be able to engage 100 weapons or so on their way in. And then as those weapons get closer to you, you've got a little bit higher capacity because you can bring electronic warfare to bear. You can bring abilities like high power microwave to bear. Shift instead to carrying a larger number of short range interceptors, like the Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, which is used by NATO navies. That missile can be carried with 4 times as much capacity as the SM-2 or SM-6 that navies usually carry. That larger number of interceptors gives you a greater defensive capacity, but it's at a shorter range. You can see the shorter range engagements go up dramatically in capacity because you're using these smaller, shorter range interceptors and electronic warfare and lasers to be able to shoot down incoming targets. And you give up a small amount of your longer range capacity in the effort to do that. So that gives you, just to kind of quantify the benefit of going to a shorter range air defense scheme. But this is something that navies and ground forces are all moving toward, recognize the need for greater capacity to deal with larger adversary salvos. Go to the next slide. The other trend we're seeing is an increased use of electronic warfare and distribution. So if you think about the missile defense problem as being one of a salvo competition, you've got to increase your own defensive capacity to provide you more survivability. But also increase the number of targets so that an enemy has to dilute their attacks over a larger number of potential areas. That will then allow your defensive capacity to maybe eventually match the salvos that you're likely to address, likely to have to address. Chart depicts approaches. So naval forces are increasingly distributed, so they can force the dilution of incoming attacks and hopefully get the size of an attack that an individual ship has to react to down to something that's within the capacity of its air defenses. Part of distribution also involves using decoys and obscuration to provide more targets to an enemy, while also reducing the ability of the enemy to discern from fake targets. So in this chart, what we're showing is on the left-hand side down towards the bottom, a large number of decoys that are out there acting like ships, or they could be used doing this in the ground environment as well. It gives the enemy additional targets to have to be concerned with. And then to prevent the enemy from being able to differentiate between the real and fake targets, we add electronic warfare systems, obscurants on both real and fake units to be able to force the adversary to not be able to discern between them and force the adversary to have to attack both of them if they want to execute a successful engagement. So this approach is being increasingly used by militaries as a way to dilute incoming attacks and bring the capacity, bring the salvo size they're likely to face down within the capacity of their air defenses. If you go to the next slide. So that's the end of the slides. The trends we're seeing is a shift towards shorter ranges to give us a greater air defense capacity and allow us to use non-kinetic capabilities, electronic warfare, high power microwave, and lasers to do missile defense, which increases your capacity, but it has to be done at range. The other trend we're seeing is this trend toward distribution and towards the greater use of electronic warfare and decoys to try to improve your salvo competition position by diluting the attacks of an adversary. And in reference to the hypersonic threat, these same trends bear true in hypersonic weapons as well. And one of the challenges we're finding with hypersonic weapons is the engagement portion of the kill chain. And as Melanie said, we need new approaches there. So some of these shifts towards a shorter range air defense scheme are also intended to address the hypersonic threat, because a hypersonic weapon, even though it's hard to engage in mid-flight, is relatively easy to gauge once it comes towards the target. And if you're the target, then you're really merely having to shoot out at the incoming weapon. It makes it easier to engage those incoming threats. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity. I know this is very relatively technical discussion, but I thought it would be a good complement to Melanie's, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
I can't hear.
We can't, Mr. Stalick, we can't hear you.
Oh no.
Now, it's my fault because my microphone was switched off. This time it was my fault.
We all have that.
Thank you very much for, it happens time to time, the technology, and every day we learn some new technologies and additional features of these softwares. Yes, Mr. Clark, thank you very much again for this nice speech and very useful, informative presentation. And you mostly mentioned about new technologies and advanced capabilities, missiles and the defense systems. And my first question for Ms. Marlowe and also for you, Mr. Clark, what do the 5th generation and the 6th generation air combats brings threats for air defense systems? What do you think about this subject, Ms. Marlowe?
Okay, well, I'm not really a particular expert on this, so I'm just going to kick it back to Brian in a moment. But I would say two things about that. One is the ability of more modern aircraft to be more stealthy. That's critical. To do a lot more onboard battle management for not just themselves, but for the larger parts of the force. And then the potential to do some pretty interesting electronic warfare. But Brian can speak to that much better than I can.
Yes, Mr. Clark? How do you think?
Yes, thanks, Melanie. So so stealth aircraft are normally designed to be hard to find in particular radar frequency bands. So X-band and S-band, which are the frequencies most radars operate at. So air defenders are going to have to think about operating in frequency bands to be able to better detect incoming stealth aircraft. So high frequency radars are becoming more popular for that. And then also radars that use different modulations to be able to overcome the stealth advantage of these 5th and 6th generation aircraft. The other thing that I'm seeing increased use of infrared sensing to try identify and target incoming aircraft. Stealth aircraft, although they're stealthy to radar, they still have a infrared signature that can be detected and used for targeting. And those type of systems are now being fielded on U.S. as well as other NATO aircraft, and also being fielded by some air defense systems. So you're seeing a move out of the S and X band of the traditional radar frequency ranges towards parts of the spectrum that are going to be better at detecting these stealth aircraft.
Okay. The second question, most of the questions are related to technical military subjects. Ms. Marlowe, what is the future of integrated air defense system? Would you like to say something about this subject?
Sure. I mean, the answer is in the question itself. On the one hand, air defense systems are in very high demand right now, as we've both talked about. But it's increasingly important that they are integrated into the larger force, that offense and defense be integrated together, but also that active air defense be synchronized, integrated tightly and coherently with active missile defenses. In the first place, the line between aerial threats and maneuvering missile threats continues to blur. So the future of active air and missile defense must be integration. Now, that means making sure everyone has a common aerial picture, as we talked about the difficulty of that, so that there's enough common knowledge and information about what's going on across the battlefield. But it also means, ideally, integrated fire control, so that you can employ the best shooter to go after a given threat. You don't want to have multiple launchers very inefficiently shooting at the same target. And integration, just in sum, is really about bringing together everything you've got, offense and defense, into a coherent and very efficient, because you don't have time to waste. And the demand signal is really going to rise for that. It's just going up.
If I ask the same question, Mr. Clark?
Sure. To build on what Melanie said, these integrated systems can take advantage of using multiple sensors in different locations to find a target. So about the stealth aircraft example, you can integrate a low frequency radar or an infrared detector with a higher frequency radar so that you can get the initial detection using that sensor that can actually see the stealth aircraft, and then transition that target over to a weapon system that might be able to engage them. Integrate in terms of missile defense and air defense. One of the challenges for air defense systems is that they aren't necessarily very good at shooting down aircraft. They're optimized for the missile threat. So being able to integrate air defense systems that can engage aircraft and shoot down the shooter, rather the archer, before he launches his arrows, will be an important element of driving down the salvo size that the defender is going to face. So having that offensive and defensive element will be really important to having a successful air defense operation. So yeah, it's multiple sensors being brought together to create a way to track time. Like Melanie said, for the hypersonic threat, using space-based sensors, for example, to cue and target interceptors that are coming from another engagement platform. Those are the kinds of things that integrated air defense systems do that a standalone system cannot do.
I think about when we think about the threats today and the future, there are different approaches also in, if you look at the administrations, for example, Trump administration had a different evaluation, and probably the new administration will follow a slightly of a different way, a path about the threats. Your personal opinions, what do you think about what is the biggest threat? Which country pose a bigger threat to the United States and NATO? I mean, I would like to listen your personal views. Ms. Marlowe, what do you think for today and for midterm future, maybe?
To the United States or to NATO or together? I mean, clearly China appears to quite be on the march right now, and they're the ones that are most actively stirring up the trouble. And I'm going to say not even just in terms of the military, but they are, calling us to attention in terms of the military. And anybody who wants to really understand how serious the issue is for us, they need to read Brian's report that he wrote at the request of the Secretary of Defense on the future of the Navy. Because the Navy is going to be important, because that area of the world is where all the focus is right now. But the difficulties that China is causing for our allies in terms of economics, right now we're seeing what they're doing in terms of all sorts of issues of diplomacy. It really shows that they have a comprehensive effort, designed to make trouble for the United States and its allies. But what I want to say about Russia is not asleep either. They're moving forward. In almost every national security speech, Putin is talking about hypersonic weapons, but other weapons as well. They're testing things, in my view, before they're ready to be done. And they're sending their own signals. And whether they're prepared to act on them today or tomorrow, the threat has to be taken seriously, I think, from both of them. They're different threats, but they need to be taken seriously.
Yes. What do you think, Mr. Clark?
Yeah, I agree. What's interesting is that the Chinese pose this very comprehensive threat that involves both missile threats, but also a lot of subconventional threats with gray zone warfare and some of the naval operations they've been undertaking. But Russia does pose this very specific missile threat to the U.S. and NATO. They've been investing, as Melanie said, in a lot of new missile technology, which are mature, trying to get to be mature. But Russia has been the country that's demonstrated both an ability and a willingness to pose missile threats to the U.S. For example, deploying several of the U.S. coast that are capable of carrying cruise missiles that could launch relatively short warning attacks or no warning attacks on U.S. Cities. Threatening that kind of escalation control measure, also threatening the use of shorter range and medium range ballistic missiles in Europe. So Russia poses this more maybe immediate missile threat, whereas China poses this much more comprehensive national threat. So both have to be taken into account, obviously, from a missile defense perspective.
Can I just say one more thing on that, just in terms of the politics? Russia is a different case, but China, the kind of trouble that they're causing, and they're trying to cause the division amongst allies, and the economic pressure that they're putting on our friends in different parts of the world. I think that they had the hope that that was going to divide us. But in the last year, what has it done? It has spurred Japan to invest more. Australia now wants to get hypersonic weapons. South Korea, these countries. And some of the smaller ones, the ones that aren't traditionally known for wanting to beef up their defenses, they're looking for ways to do that. And I think that that's critical because we need our allies in this fight. This isn't something that the United States can do alone to confront either China or Russia. So, the United States, I think it's been made clear over the last couple of years, the United States is incapable of carrying this burden alone, nor should it.
On the other side, if you look at their GDPs and the economical potentials, I think Russia is weaker than, of course, than China. China is growing rapidly. I think the total output of the Russian economy is sort of similar to Italy, even smaller than just the California state. Of course, it's not just a scale; just it gives an idea. But yes, Russia is important. But on the other hand, China is growing rapidly, and they invest heavily in different areas at the same time. As far as I follow, Russia has this kind of a capability to invest in different areas. That's why they are focusing on some sources like missiles and some computer maybe technologies. They're hacking the systems, blah blah. Do you agree with me, Mr. Clark?
Yeah, absolutely. Russia has been very targeted in the areas that they've decided to try and gain an advantage in. So missiles is one, undersea warfare is another where they've got very good capability. But they see that as a way to compensate for their shortfalls more generally when you look at the size of their military or its overall military capability. Yeah, certainly.
Would you like to add some additional things on the subject, Ms. Marlowe?
I'll say GDP is an important factor. Sure, but I would just say it depends on what you want to do with that money. I'm not going to mention any names. There's a few wealthy countries that have investing what they maybe should have or wish they would have in the last few decades. So now we're even looking at smaller countries like Sweden that are recognizing the Russia threat, and they're trying to beef up some of their defenses as well. But definitely these countries are looking at information warfare, at cyber attacks and things like that, at drones, pushing some drones over the border. Those kinds of things that cheaper, very effective though. And the United States cannot overlook that. We need to take those threats seriously too.
You are right. I think it's also important where you live. If you are a citizen of Poland, maybe you feel a little bit more different feelings against Russia.
Yeah.
But if you are far, if you live in Montreal, Quebec, Russian threat is something different.
If you're in Poland, you want Fort Trump.
In my opinion. So another question. What will new generation air defense systems planning for nuclear attacks? What do you think, Ms. Marlowe, about this subject?
I think that's a very good question. It's one that probably doesn't get enough attention, but it's also another aspect of the integration issue that we're talking about. In a world where you have major powers that are increasing the salience of nuclear weapons in the order of battle, we need to be thinking about how to integrate our non-nuclear forces and our air defenses. we are not, for example, putting nuclear warheads on our hypersonic delivery systems right now, but other countries have not been so clear about what they're doing. So we need to think about how we're going to be able to fight in a nuclear environment, or at least a post-nuclear detonation environment. And in the event that, say, Russia or China does decide to pop off a nuclear weapon, it doesn't mean that all of our conventional forces become obsolete, precisely because we don't want to escalate into a larger nuclear war. We need to be able to have as broad and flexible options as possible. So there's another angle to this as well, and that's we don't want China to get the bright idea that they can land a single nuclear weapon on Guam or something that's important to us, and that then we'll back down. And as for the fleet, along the lines that Brian discussed in his presentation and in his comments, in terms of contending with large salvos, we need our forces, our forward forces, to be able to contend with these large salvos, pretty large ones that will be coming from various kinds of attacks. And that, in the end, means a couple of things. One is that we need to find ways to distribute our forces, and we're doing more of that. We're talking about that a lot more, but we need to make them harder to target, the distributed operations and deception that Brian had in his presentation. But it also means that we're probably going to need a thick air defense of Guam and other things that we aren't going to be able to move quickly or securely. And that probably, for Guam, means Aegis ashore. I don't know what Brian thinks about that, though.
Yes.
Yeah, so certainly, we definitely are going to need to invest in a mid-course defense. And so what this brings up is nuclear are such that your short-range defenses that I was talking about may not be that effective because they may not have the range to be able to prevent the nuclear weapon from getting to the location where it's going to. So you have to have a longer-range defensive system to successfully engage those weapons before they can blow up. So Aegis ashore, is a system like that for ground-based defenses. Something like that will be necessary for Guam. It may be alternative would be to have a more distributed system. Aegis ashore becomes a very lucrative target because it's very self-contained and expensive. So maybe having the same radar system, but then having the launchers distributed around the island to do that. And the same could be applied in Japan and elsewhere, where they've looked at ground-based defenses to deal with relatively small numbers of nuclear weapons, where you have to really engage them in the mid-course rather than waiting for them to get close to the target. So that's a particular challenge of weapons, is the need for these more expensive and longer-range air defense systems. And Aegis ashore is a good example of that that's being used in Europe right now. The other thing with them is the advent of hypersonic weapons, hypersonic nuclear weapons, which are going to be extremely survivable in terms of reaching through our missile defenses. So new approaches to missile defense that involve the use of space sensors and maybe even airborne interceptors, based on aircraft, are going to be necessary to ensure that you can engage those hypersonic threats before they reach a location where they can start to, do nuclear effects, whether an EMP in the atmosphere or an actual burst or burst nuclear attack. And the last point that Melanie brought up, which I think was a very good one, which is we need to think about how to operate in a nuclear environment. So we can't just expect that once their threshold has been reached, the fight ends. It'll probably continue. So as Herman Kahn used to say, we got to think about the unthinkable. And how would we continue to operate once somebody's crossed that threshold? That was a little plug in the Institute, by the way. So, but thank you. That was a great question.
Another question about range-free missiles. Will the range-free missiles possible for air defense systems? Ms. Marlowe, what do you think?
Actually, I'm going to kick that one to Brian first.
Yes, Mr. Clark.
Is that okay?
Longer range missiles are going to, they pose a challenge for missile defenses. Obviously, the idea that we're going to have to deal with things that are being launched from another theater, I think, is something Melanie discussed. Going across theaters with longer range weapons is going to be something that is going to be challenging because you have multiple participants that are trying to track and then subsequently engage that missile. I think the idea of hypersonic weapons is also an element of that because they are going to be able to circumvent the missile defense systems that we've been deploying thus far because of the altitude at which the hypersonic weapon flies. It avoids the ground-based interceptors that we're developing, and it also avoids some of the long-range ballistic missile defense interceptors that we use for the mid-course defense. So I think that's the challenge we run into is we need a new class of air defense interceptors that are probably going to need to be air-launched to counter those missiles.
Ms. Marlowe?
I don't have any much to add about that, except we just need to really focus on what the new spectrum of threats is going to be and think about how we can best,
but I think it will be
wave those off.
Yes, thank you. But I think it will be a major issue, major subject in near future range-free missiles. And the last question. What are the new strategies for air defense systems to combat with electronic warfare? Electronic warfare is an important and critical subject, in my opinion. Ms. Marlowe, what would you like to add?
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I would say briefly that the Russians haven't made any secret that they want to jam the heck out of us. And this has been made very clear. So we need to make sure that any future air defense system that we have, any of our radars and so forth, think of the LTAMs and so on, the IBCS system, that make sure that they're as robust and resilient as they can be against attacks from electromagnetic threats. So I'm not an engineer. I don't know how we do that, but that is somewhere like cyber. It's just something that we have to take seriously now.
Yeah, it's very clear and brief and very understandable answer. And Mr. Clark?
So electronic warfare is going to be applied on both sides. So as Melanie said, incoming weapons are going to use electronic warfare to try to jam the radar looking for the incoming weapon, so the weapon can make it to the target unimpeded. And then you've also got the ability for missile defenders to use electronic warfare to help defeat weapons. As missiles, cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic weapons become more sophisticated, they need to become better at reaching the exact target they're trying to go for, which means just be guided by inertial guidance systems anymore. They need GPS, they need GLONASS, they need a seeker that actually looks for the target, and all of those guidance systems are subject to electronic warfare attack. So we can disrupt the GPS receiver or the signal that goes to a missile to prevent it from knowing where it is and knowing where it's supposed to go. You can also jam the seeker on it that's looking for a particular radar signature or an infrared image. Those can all be defeated through electronic warfare. Electronic warfare growing again as an element of missile defense because one, it gives you kind of an infinite magazine because you can continue to, as long as you have electricity, you can generate those effects. And then also it maybe exploits some vulnerabilities that these more expensive and sophisticated weapons have because they don't want to miss. And so because if you have an expensive hypersonic weapon, you want to make sure it hits the target. So you have to put some kind of guidance system on it, and that guidance system now opens it up to a potential vulnerability that electronic warfare can exploit.
So I really want to thank all of our participants, and it was a very fruitful panel. And thank you very much for your time, first of all. I really enjoyed and we learned many important things from your presentations and your speeches. And thank you very much indeed for your distinguished, very valuable contribution for this panel. And
thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
In the USA.
Thank you.
Distinguished panelists and dear audience, we will continue our Eurasia Airshow webinars tomorrow, and have a good day and good evening. Goodbye.
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 There's a world of miracles inside our bodies.
See every color on Earth. Hear sounds that inspire. Feel more than just heat. Taste a world of flavor.
Nice.
Smell the miracles of nature.
See, smell, hear, taste, touch. Widen your world.
There are those of us who like to venture to the unexplored, to see the beauty in the strange and unknown. Those of us who go out there with a sense of wonder. If you're one of us, and if you want to explore more of this great planet, we're ready to take you there. It's time. Turkish Airlines. Widen your world.